Tonight, we're not here to fix anything, not to understand everything, not to become someone better before you're allowed to rest. This is a quiet space where we gently let go and return to inner peace through soft Zen stories inspired by the Buddha, shared slowly so your mind can soften and your body can rest. Maybe today asked a little too much from you. Too many thoughts, too many worries, too many small things you tried to hold together. And maybe, just for this moment, you're ready to set them down. Here, you don't need to improve yourself. You don't need to solve tomorrow. You are already enough simply by being here, breathing quietly. Just for a moment. Where are you listening from tonight? Wherever you are, I'm grateful you're here, sharing this quiet space. Let your breath slow as if it remembers the way home. Let your shoulders soften like they no longer need to carry the world. Tonight, we'll listen to a simple story. A story from ordinary life, carrying a small thread of Zen and Buddhist wisdom. Not to give you more to think about, but to help you loosen your grip. Because suffering rarely ends by force. It softens when we stop holding it so tightly. There's nothing to rush, nothing to achieve, only a gentle drifting into rest, into stillness. Whether you stay awake or slowly fall asleep, this moment is already enough. And now, we begin tonight's journey with these Zen stories. It was late enough that the kitchen felt like a place between days. The overhead light was off. Only the small lamp near the counter was on, casting a soft, uneven glow across the island. A glass sat half full of water. Ice clinked once as it settled, then went quiet. Somewhere in the building, a dishwasher hummed distant and steady. The person stood at the counter reading a message they had already read too many times. It wasn't long. It wasn't even especially cruel. Just a sentence with a tone that caught. A line that nudged exactly where it hurt. A comment that felt unnecessary and because of that, impossible to ignore. The body reacted before the mind finished interpreting it. A quick heat in the chest, a tightening behind the ribs. The tongue pressed lightly against the back of the teeth as if already forming words. There's a specific kind of anger that shows up like this. Not explosive. More like irritation with a hook in it. The message sat there on the screen, small and contained, but it pulled. It invited a response. Not a calm one, a sharp one. Something that would put things back in balance. Something that would sting just enough. The person set the phone down on the counter, face up. The screen dimmed, but the words stayed bright in the mind. Water was poured into the glass until it reached the rim. A few drops spilled over, sliding down the side, and pooling briefly on the counter before being wiped away with the edge of a sleeve. The action was automatic grounding. The first sip was taken quickly. The second was slower. The irritation didn't leave. It lingered like something caught just inside the mouth. Not painful exactly, but impossible to forget. The urge to bite down on it, to clamp, to pull back hard. There was a memory sudden and clear of fishing as a kid. Not the quiet, patient kind, the messy kind. Hooks scattered in a metal box, fingers nicked more than once. The shock of realizing too late that a hook had gone deeper when pulled the wrong way. The worst part wasn't the initial catch. It was the instinct to yank. Hooks work because they count on that instinct. The message on the phone felt like that now. A small barb, carefully placed, waiting for movement. The person leaned their hip against the counter and stared at the walleyes unfocused. The mind started assembling replies anyway. One version calm and firm, another sarcastic, another cutting. Each one felt satisfying in the imagination. Each one also tightened the chest a little more. The body knew this pattern, knew what came after. The brief rush of hitting send, the hollow feeling afterward, the replaying, the wondering if it went too far or not far enough. The hook doesn't disappear after you bite. It digs in. The phone buzzed again. Not a new message, just a notification from somewhere else. The sound was enough to make the jaw clench. That was when it became clear the hook wasn't just in the conversation. It was in the body now. Anger like this doesn't need much fuel. It feeds on attention, on repetition, on the simple act of chewing the same thought again and again. The person placed a hand flat on the counter. Cool surface, solid, real. The other hand wrapped loosely around the glass. The ice had melted slightly. The water tasted plain. There was a quiet recognition, not dramatic, not virtuous. I'm already hurt. Swallowing another sharp word wouldn't fix that. It would only add another thing to pull out later. The message on the phone stayed unanswered, not ignored, just left where it was, the way you might leave a splinter alone for a moment instead of digging at it with dirty fingers. The irritation shifted. It didn't go away, but it changed shape. Less sharp, more like an ache. The person thought about how often arguments grow this way. One barb leads to another. One hook swallowed invites a second. Before long, both sides are bleeding and calling it honesty. The kitchen stayed quiet. The lamp hummed faintly. The night pressed gently against the windows. Nothing had been resolved. But something important had been noticed. When you've already bitten the hook, the next kind move isn't to swallow more bait. It's to stop pulling. The kitchen didn't change while the decision settled. The lamp stayed on. The glass of water stayed where it was. The phone remained face up on the counter, silent now, like it had said its piece and stepped back to watch what would happen next. There was a strange pause that followed. Not relief, not clarity, just a moment where nothing was being added. That was new. Usually this was the point where another thought would arrive sharper than the last. Another sentence would form, demanding expression. Silence often felt like losing ground, like letting the hook do its work. But standing there, hands resting on the counter, it became clear that the real damage didn't come from the first barb. It came from the tugging. The body noticed small things. The way the tongue rested in the mouth, the slight ache in the jaw from being clenched earlier, the shoulders still raised just enough to signal tension. All of it felt like evidence of something already caught. The instinct was to pull, to answer, to restore balance by making the other person feel what you felt. That instinct is fast, almost automatic. But hooks don't come out clean when you panic. Anyone who's ever had one embedded knows this. Pulling straight back only drives it deeper. The pain spikes, the damage spreads. What could have been a careful removal becomes a wound that takes longer to heal. The person reached for the phone, then stopped. Not out of willpower, but out of a sudden understanding sending another message right now would be exactly that pull. Instead, the phone was turned face down. Gently. No drama. Just a small adjustment in direction. The irritation flared briefly in response, like a muscle protesting when you stop using it the way it's weak. Then it softened, unsure where to go without a target. A breath came in slow and shallow. Another followed deeper, more settled. The chest loosened a little. Not all at once. Just enough. Silence, it turned out, wasn't passive. It was an action. Not the kind that proves anything. The kind that prevents further harm. Forgiveness started to feel less like a decision about the other person and more like a boundary around pain. A refusal to keep feeding something that was already hurting. The message hadn't disappeared. It still existed. The words were still there, but they no longer had teeth. The hook, once noticed, lost some of its power. The person took another sip of water. The glass was nearly empty now. The sound it made as it was set down was dull, final, a small closing. There would be a later moment to respond if needed. A moment when the body wasn't reacting. A moment when words could come from steadiness instead of sting. Or maybe there wouldn't be a response at all. Not every hook needs to be addressed. Some only need to be removed quietly. The dishwasher hummed on. A car passed outside. Life continued in its ordinary way, unaffected by the unsent reply. The irritation continued to fade, not into forgiveness exactly, but into space. Space where the body didn't have to stay alert. Space where the mind didn't need to sharpen itself. What remained was a clear sense of this swallowing. One more barb wouldn't make the pain smaller. It would only make it harder to heal. The night moved forward. The kitchen stayed dim and calm. The phone stayed silent. And somewhere between the counter and the quiet, the hook loosened simply because it was no longer being pulled. The night air felt sharp the moment the door opened. It rushed in cool and restless, brushing against skin that was still warm from inside. The street outside was brighter than expected. A gas station across the road glowed under fluorescent lights. Cars came and went in slow, uneven intervals. Somewhere nearby, wind moved through loose leaves, making a dry, skittering sound along the curb. The person stood still for a second, keys in hand, adjusting to the shift. Inside, everything had felt contained, predictable, quiet. Outside, the air carried a different mood, edgy, unsettled. The kind of air that makes tempers shorter and thoughts louder. Earlier, the argument hadn't ended cleanly. It hadn't exploded either. That almost made it worse. It ended with clipped sentences, with one person walking away while the other still had more to say, with that familiar sense of unfinished heat sitting just under the skin. The person had come out here to cool off. That was the plan anyway. As they crossed the lot toward the gas station, the wind picked up. Not strong, but steady. It pressed against the body, slipped under sleeves, tugged at loose fabric. The anger moved with it. The mind replayed the exchange, sharpening each line, imagining better timing, better phrasing, a final sentence that would have landed harder, something that would have closed the gap instead of leaving it open. A lighter was pulled from a pocket without much thought. Old habit. The thumb flicked it open, shielding the flame briefly as it caught. The small light flared bright and confident in the dark. For a moment it felt good. The flame steadied, casting a warm glow against the hand. The body leaned slightly forward, instinctively protecting it. Then the wind shifted. The flame bent sharply, sputtered, and sent a lick of heat back toward the fingers. Not enough to burn, but enough to sting. The person hissed softly and adjusted their grip, trying again to block the wind. The flame fought. The wind answered. The heat kept coming back. That was when the comparison landed. Anger held like this was a torch against the wind. It felt powerful in the hand. It promised clarity, direction, a way to see, but every step forward pushed the flame back toward the one carrying it. The lighter was closed with a click. The sudden darkness felt almost like relief. The person flexed their fingers, noticing the warmth lingering on the skin. Not painful, just enough to be felt. The argument replayed again, this time with more intensity. The urge to go back, to continue, to finish it properly, to say the thing that would finally make the other person understand. But standing there in the open air, it became obvious how exposed that urge was. How much energy it took to keep the anger lit against resistance. The wind didn't care about being convinced. It didn't slow down to listen. It just kept moving. The body noticed its own effort. The shoulders tense, the jaw set, the breath shallow as if preparing to push forward instead of step back. The anger hadn't made the person stronger out here. It had made them more vulnerable. Every gust redirected the heat inward. The gas station doors slid open and closed. Someone laughed briefly, then disappeared. Life continued in small, indifferent motions. The person stepped closer to the building, where the wind softened slightly. The air still moved, but less aggressively. The body responded right away. Shoulders dropped. Breath lengthened. The difference was immediate. It wasn't that the wind had stopped. It was that the person had stopped walking directly into it. The argument from earlier hadn't changed. The words were still said. The hurt was still real. But something about the posture shifted. The need to keep advancing, to keep pressing, eased just enough to notice the cost of doing so. Holding anger like a torch demanded constant adjustment, constant defense, constant awareness of how it might turn back on you. It wasn't peace. It was vigilance. The person leaned against the side of the building, feeling the cool surface through their jacket. The lighter rested heavy in the pocket, now unused. There was no decision yet to forgive, no resolution. Just a clear sense that continuing to charge forward with this heat wasn't making things safer. It wasn't making things clearer. It was only burning the hands that held it. The wind continued to move through the lot, indifferent and steady. And for the first time since the argument, the person stopped trying to fight it head on. The wind didn't stop. It moved around the building, slipped through open spaces, tugged at corners and edges. But here, pressed against the wall, it lost some of its force. It became background instead of opposition. The person stayed there longer than planned. Not to think things through, not to rehearse what to say next, just to feel what it was like not to push forward for a moment. The hands rested at the sides, now empty. Without the lighter, there was nothing to protect, nothing to aim. The fingers slowly uncurling felt almost unfamiliar, like a posture the body hadn't used in a while. Anger still lived there. It hadn't gone anywhere. But without motion, it didn't know what to do. That was the strange part. So much of the anger earlier had depended on direction, on momentum, on the idea that something had to be done with it, said finished, proven. Standing still broke that spell. The body noticed the difference immediately. The chest felt less compressed. The breath no longer stopped short at the top. The neck released a little, as if it no longer needed to brace for impact. The argument replayed again, but differently this time. Slower, less sharp. The words still had weight, but they didn't demand a counterstrike. The person realized how much effort it had taken to keep charging forward into the wind. How much energy had gone into holding the torch upright, keeping it lit, making sure it didn't go out or turn back. That effort had been mistaken for strength. But strength, it turned out, didn't feel like this. Strength felt quieter, less dramatic, more like choosing where not to stand. The lighter stayed in the pocket. The temptation to pull it out again flickered briefly, habit more than desire. Then it passed. The flame didn't need to be proven. Forgiveness began to make sense here, not as reconciliation, not as softness toward the other person, but as a change in orientation, a decision to stop walking directly into resistance. The wind hadn't been personal. It never is. It didn't know the details of the argument. It didn't care who was right. It simply moved the way it moved. Fighting it head-on had only guaranteed one outcome: getting burned. The person pushed off the wall and took a few steps back toward the car. Not rushing, not storming, just moving. With each step away from the open lot, the wind eased again. The difference was subtle but undeniable. Less noise, less pull. The body responded in kind. Forgiveness in this moment wasn't about letting anyone off the hook. It was about not letting the fire keep choosing the direction of the night. The anger could exist without being carried forward. The heat could cool without being extinguished violently. There would be a time to talk. Or not. A time to revisit what happened, or to let it remain unfinished. None of that needed to be decided right now. Right now, the body needed to stop being scorched by its own grip. The car door opened and closed again. Inside, the air was still, protected. The kind of quiet that doesn't argue with you. The seat accepted the body's weight without resistance. The keys turned. The dashboard lights came on softly. The world outside stayed windy, restless, unchanged. But inside the car, the flame was gone. Not destroyed, just set down. The person sat there for a moment before driving off, hands resting on the wheel, relaxed now. The earlier urge to rush back into the argument had faded into something more manageable, an awareness instead of a push. Anger, when met this way, didn't disappear. It transformed. It stopped being a weapon and became information. It stopped being fire and became warmth, distant and contained. The car pulled out of the lot, merging into the slow flow of traffic. Headlights stretched ahead, steady and calm. The wind continued to blow behind them, and for the first time that evening, it wasn't something to walk against. The bathroom was quiet, except for the sound of water. Not rushing, not splashing. Just a steady stream hitting tile, breaking into softer echoes that filled the small space. Steam gathered slowly, blurring the edges of everything without fully hiding it. The person stood under the shower, eyes closed, letting the warmth do what it always did. Loosen muscles that had been tight all day, soften joints that had been held too stiff for too long. That's when the anger showed up. Not loudly, not all at once. It came as a tightness in the chest, a thought that slipped in sideways, a memory of a conversation that had already ended but hadn't stopped moving inside. Someone's words, someone's tone, a look that landed wrong. It didn't seem like much on the surface, the kind of moment that other people might shrug off without thinking twice. But the body had reacted strongly, almost disproportionately. That was the part that didn't make sense. The water ran over the shoulders, down the back. A hand reached out to steady against the wall. The tile felt solid, cool under wet skin. The mind replayed the moment again, slower this time. Why did that bother me so much? The question wasn't asked gently at first. It carried an edge, an accusation, as if the anger itself were a problem to be solved. The body answered instead, a familiar tightness in the stomach, a subtle clench in the jaw, a shallow breath that didn't quite make it all the way down. This wasn't new. The realization came quietly without drama. This reaction had happened before. Different people, different situations, same sharp spike, same lingering heat. The water kept falling, patient and indifferent. The steam thickened, fogging the mirror just outside the shower door. Shapes softened, reflections blurred. A memory surfaced, uninvited but clear, standing in front of a mirror years ago, younger, trying to understand a feeling that didn't match the situation. Seeing the same tension in the face then, the same guarded expression, the same sense of being braced against something unseen. The mirror doesn't create what it shows. It only reflects what's already there. The anger from earlier began to feel less like an attack from the outside and more like a flare from somewhere inside. Not invented, but triggered. The water pressure shifted slightly, a different note in the sound. The body adjusted without thought. The person rested their forehead briefly against the tile wall. The heat felt grounding, the contact steady. It wasn't that the other person hadn't been careless or insensitive or wrong. They might have been. But the intensity of this reaction didn't belong entirely to them. It belonged to a place that had been touched, a place that hadn't healed yet. The mind resisted that idea at first. It wanted the anger to stay justified, clean, directed outward, easier that way. But the body didn't argue. It recognized the pattern. Anger in moments like this wasn't just a defense. It was a signal. Something inside had been reflected back too clearly. The mirror in the bathroom was now fully fogged. Only vague outlines remained. The person reached out and wiped a small circle with the palm of their hand. An eye stared back, then another. The face didn't look furious. It looked exposed. The water continued to fall steady and warm. The room held the sound without judgment. Forgiveness hadn't appeared yet. It didn't need to. What had appeared was understanding not of the other person, but of the self. A recognition that some reactions are echoes. Old vibrations stirred up by new contact. The anger softened slightly, losing its sharp edges. It didn't disappear, but it became less urgent, less demanding. The mirror showed what it always does, not who caused the pain, but where it lives. The water kept running, and for the first time since the moment earlier that day, the person stopped arguing with the reflection. The water was turned off slowly, not all at once. The sudden quiet felt louder than expected. Droplets slid down skin, then fell to the floor in soft, irregular taps. Steam lingered in the air, holding the warmth a little longer before letting it go. The person stayed there, still inside the fog. There was no rush to step out. No need to dry off yet. The moment felt unfinished, but not in a tense way. More like something was settling into place. The anger from earlier hadn't vanished. It hovered nearby, quieter now, less sharp. Without the noise of the water, it was easier to hear what it was actually saying. It wasn't shouting anymore. It was pointing. The mirror still fogged, except for the small cleared circle reflected a softened version of the face. Lines less defined, edges blurred. The eyes looked tired, but calmer. The person wiped the mirror again, widening the clear space. More of the face came into focus. The expression wasn't accusing. It wasn't defensive. It looked like recognition. That comment earlier in the day, the one that had landed so hard, wasn't unique. It hadn't invented the pain. It had only pressed on something that was already sensitive. A place that had learned long ago to brace. The body remembered before the mind did. Moments of being dismissed, overlooked, spoken to in ways that felt small. Moments when reacting strongly hadn't been safe, so the reaction had learned to hide. Anger had become the guard at the door. It made sense now why it showed up so fast. Why it arrived with heat and certainty. It wasn't trying to start a fight. It was trying to protect something fragile. Understanding that changed the shape of it. The anger no longer felt like an enemy to suppress or justify. It felt like a messenger that had been misdirected for years. Forgiveness seen from here wasn't about the other person at all. It was about turning toward the place that had been reflected. The towel was reached for wrapped around the shoulders. The fabric was rough and familiar grounding. The body felt heavier now, more present. Standing in front of the mirror, the person didn't analyze their face, didn't critique it, didn't search for flaws. They just looked. The reflection didn't need correcting. It needed acknowledgement. The person who had triggered the anger earlier was probably moving on with their day by now. Their words already dissolving into other conversations, other concerns. They weren't carrying this moment anymore. But the body had been. And that was where forgiveness belonged. Not as a pardon, not as an excuse, as a release of the expectation that someone else should heal what they didn't break. The mirror showed a small nod, barely perceptible. A quiet agreement between the body and the reflection. I see you. I know why that hurt. The steam began to thin. The room cooled gradually. The outlines sharpened again. The anger continued to fade, not into indifference, but into something more workable. Less explosive. More honest. The mirror returned to being just a mirror. The person stepped away, feet touching the bath mat, feeling the texture beneath them. Another ordinary sensation anchoring the moment. There would be other triggers, other reflections, other times when old wounds caught the light at the wrong angle. But now, there was a pause where there used to be a reaction. A moment to recognize what was being shown. The towel was hung up. The light dimmed. The bathroom returned to quiet. And somewhere between the fog and the clearing, the person learned this: not every anger is about the person in front of you. Sometimes it's about what they accidentally helped you see. And when that's the case, forgiveness starts at the mirror. There are moments when fear feels active, loud, obvious. And then there are moments when fear is quiet but exhausting. This was the second kind. The room was dark, not because the lights were off, but because the blinds were closed and evening had settled in without announcing itself. A single lamp in the corner stayed unlit. The phone lay on the table screen, black, finally silent after a long day of notifications. Someone sat on the edge of the couch, elbows resting on knees, hands loosely clasped. The body felt tired in a specific way. Not sore, not sleepy, just worn down from holding too much for too long. Nothing bad had happened. Nothing dramatic was wrong. And yet the mind kept pacing. It replayed conversations from earlier in the day. Small ones, ordinary ones. A comment that landed strangely. A look that might have meant something. A task that didn't get finished. A future obligation that hadn't arrived yet but was already being rehearsed. Thought after thought moved through the dark like shapes without edges. Each one felt important. Each one demanded attention. The instinct was to fight them, to argue, to reason, to analyze until clarity appeared. The mind picked up its usual weapon effort. If I think hard enough, I'll cut through this. If I keep going, I'll find the answer. It felt like standing in a dark room swinging a sword at shadows. Every swing made the heart beat faster. Every swing made the body tense more. And the shadows didn't disappear. They multiplied. Fear often tricks us into believing that force is the solution. That if something feels overwhelming, we need to push harder, think faster, control more. But darkness doesn't respond to effort. It responds to light. The body shifted on the couch. A knee bounced once, then stopped. The hands unclasped and rested flat on the thighs. A small movement, but it changed the posture from bracing to sitting. There was a moment quiet, almost unnoticeable, where the effort paused. Not because everything was solved, but because something inside grew tired of swinging. In that pause, another option appeared. Not a strategy, not a technique. Just a simple noticing, I'm trying to fix this in the dark. Fear wasn't coming from danger. It was coming from not seeing clearly. The thoughts didn't feel threatening because they were true. They felt threatening because they were vague, unfinished, half-lit. The mind was filling in gaps with worst-case outlines. The lamp was a few steps away, always had been. Standing up didn't feel decisive. It felt heavy, like moving through water. The body rose slowly, joints stiff as if unsure whether the effort would be worth it. A hand reached for the lamp. The switch clicked. Light spread outward, not dramatically, just enough. The room didn't transform. The couch stayed the same. The table, the walls, the ordinary objects revealed themselves exactly as they were. And suddenly the thoughts looked different. Not gone, but less powerful. The shadow of a coat hanging over a chair lost its sharp edges. The clutter on the table became recognizable: a notebook, a pen, a folded receipt. Things with names. The mind, given something concrete to look at, softened its grip on the imagined. Fear thrives in blur. Clarity doesn't eliminate fear. It shrinks it to size. The body responded first. A breath went deeper than the ones before it. Shoulders lowered an inch, the jaw unclenched without instruction. The thoughts were still there, but they no longer felt like attackers. They felt like messages waiting to be read properly. That's the thing about fear in dark rooms. Most of the time, it's not warning you about danger. It's telling you that you're trying to navigate without light. Light doesn't mean answers. It means presence, seeing what's actually in front of you, instead of what your mind is projecting into empty space. The lamp hummed softly, a familiar sound that had always been there unnoticed. Outside, a car passed headlights, briefly brushing across the window. The world hadn't changed, but the relationship to the world had. The mind had wanted to fight the darkness. The body had needed illumination. There was still uncertainty, still things unresolved, still tasks waiting for tomorrow. But now they had shapes, edges, boundaries. Not everything needed to be solved tonight. Some things just needed to be seen. The person stood there for a moment longer, letting the room exist as it was. Ordinary, manageable, not demanding anything extra. The sword had been set down, not because it was wrong, but because it wasn't the right tool. In a dark room, effort makes noise. Light makes sense. And with the light on it, became clear that the room had never been dangerous. It had only been unseen. With the light on the room, didn't offer answers. It offered perspective. The problems that had felt huge a few minutes earlier now sat quietly in their places. A notebook with unfinished pages, a phone that hadn't buzzed in a while, a chair that needed to be pushed back under the table. Nothing dramatic, nothing urgent. Fear had made them feel bigger than they were. That's what darkness does. It stretches things. It removes edges. It turns manageable situations into shapeless threats. The body leaned back against the wall, feeling the cool surface through fabric. The breath slowed, not because it was told to, but because it finally had room to. So much fear comes from trying to fix what hasn't been clearly seen yet. The mind wants resolution before understanding. It wants certainty before clarity. It wants to swing harder, think faster, push deeper. Believing effort will force illumination, but effort without light just creates exhaustion. In the dark room of the mind, people often confuse intensity with effectiveness. They assume that if something feels heavy, the solution must be equally heavy. That serious problems require serious force, but many fears don't need force at all. They need a pause, they need attention, they need light. Light in this sense isn't optimism, it isn't positive thinking, it isn't pretending things are fine. It's simply seeing what is actually present. Seeing the worry as a thought, not a verdict. Seeing the tension as a body response, not a sign of failure. Seeing the future as unknown, not as already ruined. The mind had been trying to win an argument with the dark. That was never going to work. Darkness doesn't argue back. It just stays. The person returned to the couch and sat down again, this time without leaning forward, without bracing. The posture changed subtly from readiness to availability. Fear didn't vanish. It softened. There was still uncertainty about tomorrow. Still conversations to have. Still responsibilities waiting in line. But now they appeared one at a time instead of all at once. Light organizes. It doesn't erase complexity, but it breaks it into pieces the body can hold. The lamp cast a circle on the floor. Inside that circle, everything was visible. Outside it, the room faded gently into shadow, and that was fine. There was no need to light the entire house at once. That's another misunderstanding. Fear creates the belief that you must see everything to be safe. In reality, you only need enough light for the next step. Fear demands total certainty. Clarity asks for honesty. Honesty says, this is what I know right now, and that is enough. The body recognized this truth faster than the mind did. The stomach released its grip. The legs stretched out. The shoulders rested where they naturally wanted to be. There was relief in not having to chase every thought. Some thoughts would return later. Some worries would knock again. The room would go dark another night. That wasn't a problem. Now, there was a different response available. Not swinging, not fighting, not forcing insight. Just reaching for the switch. In daily life, that switch can look like asking one clear question instead of 10 anxious ones. It can look like writing something down instead of holding it in your head. It can look like resting your attention on what your hands are doing instead of what your mind is predicting. Light can be simple. Fear wants complexity. Understanding wants presence. The room stayed lit. The lamp hummed. Time moved quietly forward. Nothing asked to be fixed. Nothing demanded proof. Eventually, the body leaned into the back cushion. The light was still on, but it no longer felt necessary to stare at everything. Seeing once was enough. The dark room hadn't been a threat. The effort had been, and with that realization, something settled, not permanently, not perfectly, but enough. Enough to stop swinging, enough to breathe, enough to sit in a room that was no longer confusing. The light didn't defeat the dark. It made it unnecessary to fight. And that was the quiet shift that mattered. The storm didn't arrive suddenly. It built itself slowly, the way most storms do. The sky had been heavy all afternoon, clouds layered thick and low. The light flattened into a dull gray that made time feel longer than it was. By evening, the wind picked up just enough to be noticed. Not violent, just insistent. A person stood on a small covered porch looking out at the water. The lake stretched wide and dark, its surface no longer smooth. Small waves bumped into one another, overlapping, changing direction without warning. Wind pushed them, then pulled back, then returned again. The weather app had warned about this. Gusts, possible storms. Nothing extreme, but enough to make people uneasy. Inside the house, the windows were closed. The lights were on. Everything was technically safe. And still the body felt unsettled. Not because of the storm itself, but because of what the storm represented. Uncertainty. The kind you can't argue with. The kind you can't schedule or plan around. The kind that doesn't ask for permission before it shows up. The wind rattled the porch railing. A loose chime clinked softly, irregular, slightly off rhythm. The sound should have been calming, but tonight it felt sharp, like the world tapping on the shoulder repeatedly. The mind responded the way it always does. What if this gets worse? What if something breaks? What if I should have prepared more? Thoughts moved fast, hopping from one possible outcome to another. Power outages, flooded roads, things going wrong in ways that hadn't happened yet. The body followed suit. Breath grew shallow, muscles tightened. A subtle readiness took over, as if bracing could somehow control the weather. Fear likes storms. Not because storms are dangerous, but because they are unpredictable. Unpredictability gives fear space to grow. Out on the water, a single small fishing boat moved slowly near the far edge of the lake. The motor was off. The person inside sat steady, letting the boat rise and fall with the waves rather than fighting them. It was strange to watch. From the porch, the waves looked aggressive, chaotic, like they might tip the boat at any moment. The instinct was to tense up just watching it, imagining how it would feel to be out there. But the boat stayed upright. It wasn't resisting the water. It wasn't trying to flatten the waves. It was moving with them. The sight held attention longer than expected. There was something oddly calming about the rhythm. Up, down, sideways, then steady again. The waves weren't the problem. The resistance to them would have been. The mind made the connection slowly, reluctantly. Fear had been reacting to the storm as if it were a personal threat, as if the goal was to make it stop, to calm it, to control it. But storms don't negotiate. They pass when they pass. The fishermen didn't look hurried, didn't look panicked. They weren't trying to leave the water immediately, but they weren't ignoring the storm either. The posture was alert, not rigid. Responsive, not reactive. That distinction mattered. There's a difference between attention and tension. Attention watches, tension fights. The body on the porch was tense. It had been fighting the storm from a distance, as if worry itself were a form of protection. But worry doesn't calm water. It only agitates the mind. The wind gusted again, stronger this time. Leaves skittered across the porch floor. The chime struck metal against metal, then went quiet. For a moment, fear surged. The familiar spike. The internal command to do something. But there was nothing to do. The house was secure. The door was closed. The situation hadn't changed. Only the mind had. The body noticed the railing under the hands, solid, cool. The porch floor beneath bare feet. The sound of rain beginning lightly tapping the roof in uneven patterns. These were facts. The imagined disasters were not. Fear had been trying to flatten the storm to make it behave, to restore calm through force. But the fisherman wasn't doing that. The fisherman was staying balanced. Balance didn't mean stillness. It meant responsiveness. The waves rose higher for a moment, then eased. The boat tilted, corrected, tilted again. Nothing dramatic, just movement. The storm wasn't personal. It wasn't aimed. It was simply weather doing what weather does. That realization didn't make the fear disappear, but it changed how it was held. Fear became information instead of a command. Pay attention, stay aware, but don't panic. The body on the porch mirrored that shift. Shoulders lowered slightly. Breath slowed just a touch. The grip on the railing softened. The storm was still there. The waves were still uneven. But something inside had stopped trying to make them stop. The fisherman remained on the water, moving with the rhythm instead of against it. And from the porch, watching that small, steady figure, a quiet understanding began to form. Calm doesn't mean the storm is gone. It means you've learned how to ride the waves. The storm continued, but it no longer felt like an emergency. Rain came down harder now, streaking across the surface of the lake, breaking it into 1,000 shifting patterns. The waves grew taller for a while, then settled, then rose again. Nothing followed a straight line. Everything moved in response to something else. The fishermen stayed where they were, not stubbornly, not carelessly, just attentive, hands steady, body loose enough to adjust, firm enough not to collapse. From the porch, it became clear that the calm wasn't in the water. It was in the way the boat met the water. That's what fear often misses. It thinks peace requires smooth conditions. It believes calm only arrives when everything behaves. But life rarely offers that. Storms come in many forms, not just weather, but deadlines that pile up, plans that fall apart, news that shifts the ground under your feet. The kind of storms that don't pass in minutes or hours, but stretch across months. The instinct in those moments is to tighten, to brace, to fight the movement, to demand stability from something that is by nature unstable. That instinct is understandable. It's human. But tightening doesn't make the waves smaller. It just makes you more likely to tip. The body on the porch felt that truth in a very physical way. The muscles that had been clenched earlier were now tired. The tension hadn't kept anything safe. It had only made watching harder. Fear had promised control. What it delivered was strain. The fisherman wasn't fearless. They were aware. There's a difference. Fear says something bad is about to happen. Awareness says something is happening. Awareness responds. Fear reacts. The wind shifted direction slightly. Rain angled sideways. The fishermen adjusted their position, not dramatically, just enough. The boat stayed upright. That adjustment mattered more than strength. In life, too, it's not strength that keeps you steady in uncertainty. It's flexibility. The willingness to shift without breaking. To respond without panicking. A thought surfaced quietly. I don't need the storm to stop to be okay. That thought didn't feel like optimism. It felt like realism. The storm wasn't going to consult anyone's comfort level before moving on. Waiting for perfect conditions would mean never stepping onto the water at all. Peace in that sense isn't about control. It's about relationship. Your relationship to the waves, your relationship to change, your relationship to fear itself. Fear, when listened to properly, doesn't demand escape. It asks for presence. Be here, pay attention, stay upright. The body on the porch shifted weight from one foot to the other. The rain soaked the edge of the porch, darkening the wood. Cool air brushed skin. Sensations returned, grounding attention in the present moment instead of projected futures. The fisherman eventually turned the boat slightly, angling toward shore, not rushing, not delaying, just choosing a moment that felt right. That choice wasn't driven by panic. It was guided by awareness. The difference was subtle, but everything. When fear leads, choices feel desperate. When awareness leads, choices feel timely. The storm began to move on slowly, without ceremony. Rain softened. Wind lost its edge. The lake remained restless, but less aggressive. The fisherman reached the shore and secured the boat. No victory pose, no relief on display, just the end of a passage. Watching that, the body on the porch felt something settle. Not safety, not certainty. Trust, not in outcomes, but in the ability to stay present through them. Storms would come again, stronger ones, quieter ones. Ones that lasted longer than expected. That wasn't in doubt. What mattered was knowing that calm wasn't something you waited for. It was something you practiced. Not by flattening waves, not by fighting the wind, but by learning how to stay balanced when everything moves. The rain stopped completely. The lake breathed out ripples, smoothing into longer lines. The porch felt still again. The storm had passed. Not because it was controlled, but because it had run its course. And the understanding remained steady as the ground beneath bare feet. You don't need the sea to be calm. You need to know how to ride it. At first it felt like an ending, not the dramatic kind. No announcement, no clear moment where everything stopped. Just a quiet sense that something familiar was no longer there. The office badge had been turned in earlier that day. Not with anger, not with relief either. Just a brief exchange, a polite nod, a thank you for everything, and then the door closing behind them with a soft, ordinary sound. The parking lot looked the same as it always had. Same faded lines, same trees along the edge, leaves barely moving in the late afternoon air. Cars coming and going, people heading home, already shifting into evening routines. And yet something had ended. In the car, the engine stayed off for a while. Hands rested on the steering wheel, not gripping, just holding. The body didn't know what to do next. Not because there were no options, but because all the options felt unfamiliar. When a chapter closes without a clear replacement, the space it leaves can feel unbearable. The mind rushed in quickly. What now? What if this was a mistake? What if I don't become anything else? Fear didn't arrive as panic. It arrived as heaviness. Like the air inside the chest had thickened. Like movement required more effort than usual. The future, suddenly wide open, didn't feel like freedom. It felt like exposure. People talk about change as growth, but the moment before growth doesn't feel expansive. It feels tight, confined, uncertain, like being wrapped in something you didn't choose. A cocoon doesn't look like a beginning. It looks like a burial. The car door opened. The sound echoed briefly, then disappeared into the open air. Feet touched the pavement. The ground felt solid, reassuring in a way the thoughts were not. Walking toward the car, someone else laughed on their phone. Another person loaded groceries into a trunk. Life continued at full speed, indifferent to one person's internal collapse. That contrast made it worse. How can everything keep going when I don't know who I am right now? The body moved on autopilot. Seatbelt clicked. Engine turned over. The radio came on, then was turned off immediately. Silence felt more honest. The drive home was slow, not because of traffic, but because there was no urgency to arrive. Home felt different now, too. Less like a resting place, more like a waiting room. Waiting for what exactly wasn't clear. At a red light, the car idled. Brake pressed, released, pressed again. A familiar rhythm, comforting in its predictability. Predictability had been lost earlier that day. That loss hurt more than the job itself. Humans adapt to effort. They adapt to pressure. What they struggle with is the absence of structure. Structure gives shape to identity. Take it away, and the question appears, who am I without this? Fear loves that question. It feeds on it. If you don't know who you are, you're unsafe. If you're unsafe, you need to hurry. If you hurry, you might survive. The body responded accordingly. Jaw tightened, shoulders lifted, breath shortened again, as if tension could substitute for direction. The light turned green. The car moved forward. Streets passed. Familiar turns were taken without thinking. Muscle memory did its job even when the mind couldn't. Home appeared ahead. Same building, same porch, same door. The place hadn't changed, but the person entering it had. Inside, the air felt still. Shoes were kicked off. Keys dropped into the usual bowl with a dull clink. The sound echoed slightly longer than usual. Nothing filled the silence. There was no email to check, no schedule to follow, no immediate task demanding attention. Freedom in its raw form can feel terrifying. The body sat down heavily on the couch. Hands rested in the lap. The feeling that rose wasn't relief. It was vulnerability. Without the old role, without the familiar expectations, there was nothing to hide behind. That's when the fear deepened. Not fear of failure, fear of disappearing. What if this is it? What if this is where I stop? The mind painted images of being left behind, of stagnation, of being forgotten. It treated this pause like a permanent state instead of a transition. The cocoon felt tighter. But even in that constriction, something subtle was happening. The old shape was already gone. The job, the title, the routines that had defined days for years. They were dissolving whether the mind agreed or not. The discomfort wasn't a sign of decay. It was a sign of change underway. Change doesn't ask for permission. It doesn't wait until you feel ready. It begins quietly, often when you think you're losing something essential. The room stayed silent. The body stayed still. Fear continued to press in from all sides. And beneath it all, unnoticed at first, there was a faint sense of movement. Not forward, not backward, inward. The cocoon was closing, not to end something, but to prepare for what couldn't happen in the open. The stillness didn't lift right away. The evening stretched on without offering direction. The clock moved. Light shifted across the room. Outside, someone walked past the window, footsteps fading as quickly as they appeared. Inside, the body remained heavy, like it had been wrapped in something thick and unfamiliar. This is the part people don't talk about when they talk about change. They talk about breakthroughs, fresh starts, becoming something new. They don't talk about the in-between, the quiet, cramped place where the old shape is gone and the new one hasn't formed yet. The cocoon is not comfortable. It's not inspiring. It's not reassuring. It's disorienting. Inside it, nothing looks like progress. There are no signs you're doing it right. No evidence that something better is on the way, just pressure, waiting, and the unsettling sense that you can't go back. The body shifted on the couch, then didn't. There was nowhere to move that felt better. The urge to distract surfaced, check the phone scroll, fill the space with noise. But even that felt pointless. Sometimes the cocoon removes distractions on purpose, not as punishment, as necessity. Transformation requires stillness, and stillness is rarely chosen voluntarily. Fear rose again, quieter this time, but deeper. What if I stay like this? What if nothing comes next? The mind treated the cocoon like a tomb, a place where things go to end. It mistook enclosure for extinction, but nature doesn't work that way. A cocoon is not where life stops, it's where form dissolves. Inside, the caterpillar doesn't simply grow wings, its old structure breaks down completely. What it was cannot continue. What it will become cannot exist yet. There is a period where it is neither. That's the part that feels unbearable. The body doesn't like being formless. The mind doesn't like ambiguity. Both search for familiar edges to lean on. When those edges disappear, panic makes sense. But panic doesn't mean danger. It means transition. The room felt smaller than before, not because the walls had moved, but because the sense of identity they once held was no longer there. The old reference points, workday rhythms, expectations, future outlines had faded. What remained was presence. Just this room, this body, this breath. No title required. The breath unnoticed earlier became steadier. Not calm, just consistent. In, out, in, out. Proof that something was still moving even if it couldn't be named. The cocoon doesn't ask you to understand what's happening inside it. It asks you to stay. To not tear yourself open prematurely, just to escape the discomfort. People often try to break out of this phase too early. They rush into the next role, the next distraction, the next identity, not because it fits, but because it's familiar. That's how growth gets delayed. The cocoon needs time, and time needs trust. Not trust that everything will be perfect, just trust that this tightness isn't the end of the story. The body leaned back slightly, surrendering a fraction of its resistance. The muscles didn't relax fully. They just stopped fighting the pressure. That was enough. The fear didn't disappear, but it changed tone. Less catastrophic, more curious. What if this isn't failure? What if this is formation? The thought didn't land as belief. It landed as possibility. Possibility is quieter than certainty. It doesn't demand agreement. It just opens a door a crack and waits. Outside, the sky darkened completely. Streetlights came on. The day finished whether or not anything had been decided. That too was instructive. Life continues even when identity is in flux. Breathing continues. Time continues. Nothing essential had been lost. Something essential was rearranging. The cocoon didn't feel welcoming yet, but it no longer felt like a grave. It felt like a pause with purpose, even if that purpose couldn't be named from the inside. Eventually, the body stood and moved through the room slowly, without agenda. A glass of water. A light turned off. Curtains adjusted. Small acts of care. Inside the cocoon, care matters more than clarity. The future remained undefined. That was still uncomfortable, but it no longer felt fatal. Change doesn't announce what it's making. It only asks you to let the old shape go. The cocoon held that letting go quietly. Not forever, just long enough. And in that enclosed, uncertain space, something unseen continued its work, not destroying what had been, but making room for what could not exist before. It happened over something small. Not a breakup, not a job loss, not a disaster. Just a tiny moment at a kitchen table that somehow felt like proof. A person sat under a warm overhead light with a notebook open and a pen that had stopped working. The page wasn't important. A few lines, a list of things to do, some half-finished thoughts, nothing that should have mattered. But the pen wouldn't write. They scribbled harder, tried again, pressed the tip against the paper with more force like effort alone could bring ink back. Nothing. The frustration rose quickly. Not because of the pen, because of what the pen represented. Another thing that doesn't work. Another sign that I can't get it together. The mind loves to turn small failures into identity statements. It doesn't say, "This pen is out of ink." It says, "You always end up stuck." That's how fear grows. It gathers evidence from tiny moments and builds a case. The body tightened. The jaw set. The shoulders pulled forward. The chest felt slightly compressed like air had less room. The pen was just a pen, but the feeling wasn't. The feeling was about pressure. Pressure to keep moving. Pressure to keep improving. Pressure to become something more than whatever this moment looked like. The person stared at the blank tip of the pen as if it had betrayed them. Then, without really thinking, they snapped it. Not in half. Just enough to make a small crack. A quiet plastic touch sound. The kind of sound that feels childish the moment it happens, like you've revealed you're not as calm as you pretend to be. They froze, listening to the silence that followed. The crack in the pen wasn't dramatic. The world didn't react. But inside, something did. Shame. Not loud, just a flush in the face. A heat that rose to the ears. The kind of shame that says, "Really, you can't even handle a pen." The mind piled on. What's wrong with me? Why am I like this? Why can't I just... The second arrow. The first arrow was frustration. The second arrow was self-attack. The pen lay on the table, slightly broken, useless now. The person's hand hovered over it, then pulled back, as if touching it would confirm the story. It would have been easy to spiral from there. To take this small moment and connect it to every other unfinished thing. Every delay, every failure. Every time life didn't look the way it was supposed to look. The mind does that naturally. It builds a timeline of regret. But there was something else in the room that night, something quiet and ordinary. A bowl of nuts sat on the counter, bought for snacking, mostly ignored. In the bowl was an acorn mixed in by accident from a fall decoration someone had left behind. Smooth brown capped, perfectly intact. It had been sitting there for weeks. The person noticed it only because their eyes needed somewhere else to land, somewhere that didn't accuse. They stood up and walked to the counter, not as a decision, more like a drift. Fingers picked up the acorn. It was surprisingly solid, heavier than it looked. The cap rough under the thumb. The shell smooth under the rest of the fingers. A small object. Quiet. Complete. And still inside it was something enormous. An oak tree doesn't arrive by staying intact. The acorn has to split. It has to break open. It has to lose its perfect shell. If it stays closed, it stays small forever, safe, whole, and useless. Growth requires fracture, not the violent kind, the natural kind. The kind that happens when something inside becomes too large for the old container. Holding the acorn, the person's breathing changed without noticing. Slower, lower. The mind didn't stop, but it softened. The broken pen on the table wasn't a disaster. It was a crack, a small break in the image of being in control. And that image, the perfect shell, had been exhausting to maintain. Sometimes the fear isn't that you'll fail. It's that you'll crack. Because cracking means you can't pretend anymore. You can't keep the smooth surface. You can't hide the pressure inside. But cracking is also how things begin. The person set the acorn down gently and returned to the table. The broken pen looked smaller now, less symbolic. More like what it actually was, a pen that needed replacing. They opened a drawer, found another one, tested it on the paper. Ink flowed easily. The line appeared without struggle. A small relief. But the deeper shift wasn't about the pen working. It was about the realization that the crack didn't ruin anything essential. The crack had simply revealed how tightly they'd been holding themselves together. The to-do list on the page was still there. The future was still uncertain. The pressure didn't disappear, but something had changed in the way it was carried. Not as a flawless shell, more like a seed that could break open. The crack stayed with them longer than expected. Not the crack in the pen that had already been tossed into the trash, but the idea of it. The sound. The feeling of something giving way after being held too tightly for too long. The evening moved on in small, ordinary steps. Dishes rinsed, lights dimmed. The notebook closed and set aside without being finished. Nothing heroic, nothing resolved. And yet the body felt different. Not lighter, not confident, just less armored. For a long time, effort had been confused with growth. The belief had been simple: if you push hard enough, if you keep yourself intact, if you don't show cracks, you'll eventually become what you're supposed to be. But effort alone doesn't create expansion. Sometimes it just creates pressure. The acorn sat back in its bowl on the counter, unchanged, quiet. It didn't announce what it would become. It didn't rush. It didn't compare itself to trees already standing tall. It simply waited for the conditions that would break it open. That's the part people misunderstand about growth. They imagine it as addition, more skills, more confidence, more success, layered on top of what's already there. But real growth is often subtraction, the loss of an old identity, the collapse of a familiar plan, the breaking of a shell that once felt protective. Fear shows up right at that breaking point. Not because something has gone wrong, but because something irreversible has begun. The fear says this is falling apart. Understanding says this is making room. Those two voices can sound very similar in the moment. The body leaned against the counter, feeling the cool surface through the thin fabric of a shirt. The breath moved in and out, steady now, not forced. The tightness in the chest hadn't vanished, but it no longer felt like an emergency. Cracking didn't mean failure. It meant pressure had reached its limit. And pressure reaching its limit is not a personal flaw. It's a physical truth. Seeds crack because they must, not because they are weak. The fear earlier hadn't been about the pen. It hadn't even been about productivity. It had been about losing the image of being composed, capable, unbreakable. But unbreakable things don't grow. They stay the same. The future still felt uncertain. That hadn't changed. There were still unanswered questions, still moments ahead that would test patience and confidence. But the fear of cracking had softened, because cracking had already happened and the world hadn't ended. Nothing essential had been lost. What had been lost was the illusion of needing to stay perfectly intact. The acorn didn't become a tree by staying whole. It became a tree by letting itself split. The thought didn't arrive as motivation. It arrived as permission. Permission to be unfinished. Permission to be in process. Permission to not know exactly who this version of yourself was becoming. The pressure to figure it all out eased slightly. Not because answers appeared, but because the demand for them relaxed. Growth doesn't always feel like moving forward. Sometimes it feels like breaking down. And that breaking down isn't the opposite of becoming. It's the entrance. The kitchen light cast a soft glow across the counter. Outside, the night stayed quiet. No signs, no messages, no confirmations. Just time moving steadily, doing what time does best. The acorn remained where it was whole for now, waiting for soil, water, darkness, the very things that would eventually break it open. And for the first time in a while, that breaking didn't feel like something to avoid. It felt like something to trust. Not because it would be easy, but because it was necessary. The crack wasn't the end of strength. It was the end of pretending that strength meant never breaking at all. It starts with something small. So small it almost feels silly to notice. A comment that didn't land quite right. A look that was hard to read. A message that didn't get a reply as quickly as expected. Nothing that should matter this much. And yet it does. The kitchen is quiet. Late evening quiet. The kind where appliances make more noise than people. A mug sits on the counter, tea still steaming gently. The spoon rests inside it, unmoving. At least for now. The thought arrives without warning. Did I misunderstand that it sounds harmless, curious, reasonable? The spoon moves. Just once, a slow stir. The surface of the tea shifts circles, forming steam rising unevenly. Nothing dramatic, just motion. Another thought follows. Maybe they meant something else. The spoon turns again, this time a little faster. The tea darkens as leaves swirl up from the bottom. What was clear a moment ago becomes cloudy. Patterns overlap. It's harder to see through now. The mind does the same thing. One small concern pulls another into it. That one connects to a memory. The memory brings up an old feeling. Soon the original moment, the comment, the look, the message barely matters anymore. It's been buried under layers of interpretation. The spoon keeps moving. There's a familiar sense of urgency. as if stopping now would be irresponsible, as if the truth is hiding somewhere in the motion, waiting to be uncovered if the stirring continues just a bit longer. But the harder the tea is stirred, the less clear it becomes. The mug is lifted. A sip is taken too soon. The heat surprises the mouth slightly, not painful, just enough to cause a pause. That pause matters. In that brief stillness, it's noticeable how tight the jaw is, how shallow the breath has become, how much energy is being spent on something that began as almost nothing. This is how overthinking grows. Not from big problems, but from small ones given too much movement, too much attention, too many turns of the spoon. A storm doesn't need a sky. Sometimes a cup is enough. The spoon is set down on the counter. It makes a soft clink against the ceramic. The sound is small, but it cuts through the noise in the mind more effectively than expected. Without the stirring, the tea doesn't settle immediately. It keeps moving for a while. Currents cross. Leaves spin lazily before sinking again. The mind behaves the same way. Even when attention stops feeding it, thoughts don't vanish on command. They continue their motion out of habit. Old momentum carrying them forward. There's a temptation to stir again, to check, to make sure nothing important is being missed, to regain a sense of control. But instead there's watching, just watching. The tea slowly begins to clear, not completely, not perfectly, but enough that shapes start to soften. The surface smooths out. Steam rises evenly again. Nothing new was added. Nothing was fixed. The storm quieted because it was no longer being created. This realization doesn't arrive as a lesson. It arrives as relief. Quiet, understated relief. The kind that doesn't need to be named. The mug is held in both hands now. Warmth seeps into the palms. The body responds before the mind does, shoulders easing slightly. Breath lengthening without instruction. The original thought still exists somewhere in the background. It hasn't been solved. No conclusion has been reached. And yet it no longer feels urgent. It was never the size of the issue that caused the strain. It was the constant stirring. The kitchen remains the same. Same counter, same mug, same quiet hum of appliances. But inside, something has shifted. The storm is still capable of returning. All it would take is one more stir, one more round of what if, or maybe, or I should figure this out right now, but for the moment, the spoon stays down, and the tea is allowed to be just tea. The mug stays on the counter untouched for a while. The tea continues to cool slowly without being asked to. Steam thins, then fades. What was once restless begins to settle into something quieter, something more readable. The same happens inside. Thoughts don't disappear just because the spoon has been set down. They drift. They cross paths. A few bump into each other gently like leftover waves after a boat has passed. But there's less force behind them now, less urgency pushing them forward. This is the part that often gets missed. People assume calm arrives when problems are solved, when answers are found, when clarity is achieved. But often calm arrives earlier than that, right at the moment when we stop adding motion. the mind returns to the original moment. The comment, the look, the delayed reply. Seen now without the swirl around it, it looks smaller. Not unimportant, just limited. One moment among many, no longer carrying the weight of every past experience or imagined future. It's easier to see how narrow the view had become. When attention locks onto one small detail, everything else falls away. Context disappears. Perspective shrinks. The world reduces itself to a single cup being shaken over and over until the movement feels like chaos. But the storm was never in the tea. It was in the stirring. The mug is lifted again. This time the sip is careful. The temperature is right. The taste is mild, ordinary, nothing remarkable. And yet it feels different now. Without the constant movement, the tea doesn't demand attention. It doesn't need to be managed. It simply exists steady and quiet. There's a soft recognition that the same could be true for the mind. Overthinking doesn't usually come from deep curiosity or genuine concern. It comes from a subtle fear that if we don't keep stirring, something will be missed. Something will go wrong. Something important will slip through unnoticed. But standing here holding a calm cup of tea, that fear feels less convincing. Nothing collapsed when the stirring stopped. Nothing urgent appeared. Nothing was lost. The kitchen clock ticks softly. Time continues indifferent to how much attention it's given. The night deepens outside the window. Lights in nearby buildings turn off one by one. The mind notices this too. The way the world keeps moving without commentary, without analysis, without asking to be understood. Perspective widens. That small moment from earlier doesn't disappear. It just finds its proper size. One piece of a much larger picture. Not a verdict, not a threat. Just a moment that happened and then passed. This widening is gentle, not forced. It doesn't feel like thinking differently. It feels like seeing more. The spoon remains on the counter where it was left. Its presence is almost symbolic now, a reminder of how easily things can be set into motion and how easily they can be left alone. There's no rule against stirring, no vow to never think again. Tomorrow will bring new moments, new reactions, new reasons to pick up the spoon. But tonight, there's understanding. A storm doesn't need to be fought. It often just needs to stop being created. The mug is placed in the sink. Water runs briefly, rinsing the inside clean. No scrubbing. No effort. Just a simple reset. The body moves more slowly now. Lights are dimmed. The kitchen fades into shadow. Nothing calls for attention anymore. Inside, the mind follows suit. Thoughts stretch out. Spaces between them grow longer. Not empty, just quiet enough to rest in. The storm is gone. Not because it was defeated, not because it was solved, but because the stirring ended. And in that stillness, even small things are allowed to return to their natural shape. The backyard isn't big. Just a small patch of grass, a narrow garden bed along the fence, and a few potted plants near the porch. Nothing you'd put on a magazine cover. but it's enough to step outside and feel the air change. Early evening light sits low, warm, but not bright. The neighbors' houses are quiet. Somewhere a sprinkler clicks on and off in a slow rhythm. A porch light glows in the distance. Everything feels normal. And then there they are. Weeds. Not a dramatic invasion. Just a few stubborn ones poking up between the good plants like they've been waiting all week for this moment. Some are thin and sharp. Others are wide and confident. They don't look dangerous, just annoying. The kind that make you feel behind, even when you're not. A hand reaches down and pulls. The first one comes out easily, a small victory. The second is tougher. It breaks at the stem, leaving roots behind. The third refuses, completely tugging back like it has its own opinion. It's easy to feel irritated. Not because the weeds matter that much, but because they represent something familiar. The sense that if you don't stay on top of things, they grow. If you rest too long, you pay for it. If you stop managing, life gets messy. The mind works the same way with worry. You notice one anxious thought. You pull at it. You try to remove it quickly. Sometimes it works, sometimes it breaks and leaves pieces behind. Sometimes you pull so hard you disturb the soil around it, and suddenly everything feels even more unsettled. There's a small pile of weeds forming near the edge of the garden bed. A quiet proof of effort, proof of trying. But the more time spent pulling, the more weeds seem to appear. Like the act of looking for them makes them multiply. Like attention itself invites them to show up. That's the trap. Overthinking often feels productive. It feels like pulling weeds, like cleaning up the mental space, like getting rid of what shouldn't be there. But some nights, the mind can spend hours pulling and still feel no cleaner, still feel no calmer, still feel like there's more to fix. The air shifts slightly. A breeze moves through the fence slats. Leaves on a nearby tree rustle softly, then settle again. The hand pauses, not in defeat, just in honesty. The garden bed looks disturbed now, soil scattered, small plants slightly bent from all the reaching and grabbing. The weeds are fewer, sure, but the space doesn't feel more beautiful. It just looks worked over. And it's hard not to recognize that feeling inside too. The way the mind can spend the whole evening yanking at worry, trying to remove every uncomfortable thought, only to end up tired and tense. Like you've been handling your feelings all night, but somehow you feel less steady than when you started. A small gardening trowel lies nearby. A packet of seeds, folded and worn at the edges, sits on the porch table. It's been there for days, unopened. The plan was to plant something good, something that would actually belong in this space. But the weeds kept taking priority. It's a familiar pattern. When the mind is anxious, it focuses on what's wrong, what needs to be removed, what needs to be fixed. The whole inner world becomes a cleanup project. And joy, simple joy, gets postponed until the mind is clear enough to deserve it. But that day doesn't always come, because the weeds don't stop growing just because you're tired. The hand wipes dirt on the side of a pant leg. The posture shifts. Instead of bending down to search for the next weed, the body straightens. Eyes lift slightly, taking in the whole bed instead of scanning for problems. The garden isn't only weeds. There are green leaves that are still healthy. There's a small flower that managed to bloom anyway. There's a plant that's hanging on, doing its quiet work, even with weeds nearby. That's something the anxious mind forgets. It sees the weeds and assumes the whole garden is ruined. But gardens are never perfect. They're alive, messy, seasonal, changing. The weeds don't mean failure. They mean it's a garden. The packet of seeds is picked up. It feels light in the hand, almost laughably simple compared to all the effort spent pulling. The fingers run across the label, reading it slowly. No big hope attached to it, no pressure, just a small intention. Not to fight the weeds harder, but to grow something else. The packet of seeds is opened carefully, as if it might tear too easily. Inside, the seeds are smaller than expected, light, unimpressive. Nothing about them suggests they could change much of anything. That's part of the hesitation. Weeds feel urgent. They demand attention right away. They're visible, annoying, easy to blame for how the garden looks. Seeds, on the other hand, ask for patience. They don't show results immediately. They require trust. The soil is loosened gently this time, not torn apart, just opened enough to receive something new. Fingers move slower now, more deliberate. Less force, less resistance. A few seeds are placed into the ground. Not many. No attempt to cover every empty space. Just enough to begin. The soil is pressed down lightly. Water is poured in a thin stream, careful not to wash anything away. The earth darkens as it absorbs what it needs. The surface looks ordinary again. No sign of what was just planted. And that's the point. The mind doesn't always recognize nourishment when it's quiet. Anxious thoughts tend to scream. They show up loud and convincing, demanding to be handled immediately. Calm thoughts don't do that. They arrive softly. They wait to be noticed. Overthinking focuses on removal, on getting rid of what feels uncomfortable. But relief often comes from addition, from introducing something steady, kind, and supportive into the space. Not to replace everything, just to change the balance. The watering can is set down. Hands are wiped clean. The garden bed looks unfinished. Some weeds still remain. They weren't all pulled. Some were left exactly where they were. And surprisingly, that feels okay. The goal was never perfection. It was care. The same shift happens inside. There are still worries present, still thoughts that would like attention, still familiar loops waiting in the background. But now, alongside them, there's something else. A softer focus. Attention moves from what needs to be removed to what might help. From fighting anxiety to supporting ease. From asking, how do I stop this, to quietly wondering, what would help right now? That question doesn't demand an answer either. It opens a door. Maybe it's rest, maybe it's warmth, maybe it's doing one small kind thing that has nothing to do with fixing the mind. Like planting seeds. Weeds grow quickly. They don't need permission. They don't need encouragement. Anxiety works the same way. It shows up uninvited, filling empty spaces without effort. But what grows slowly often lasts longer. The garden won't change overnight. Tomorrow it might look exactly the same. The weeds may even appear more noticeable now that the seeds have been planted. That doesn't mean the effort was wasted. It means growth is happening below the surface. The mind learns this lesson gradually. Instead of scanning constantly for anxious thoughts to remove attention, can return to what's being cultivated. A calm breath, a gentle routine, a moment of appreciation, a feeling of safety in the body. These things don't shout. They don't compete. They simply grow when given space. The light fades as evening deepens. Shadows stretch across the yard. The garden bed disappears into darkness, holding its quiet work beneath the soil. Inside, there's a similar sense of trust forming. Not that anxiety will never return. Not that the weeds are gone for good, but that fighting them endlessly isn't the only option. The gardener doesn't stand watch all night. There's no need. The work that needed to be done has been done. What happens next doesn't require supervision. The same is true here. The mind doesn't need to monitor every thought. It doesn't need to patrol for weeds. It can rest knowing that something else has been planted. Something patient, something steady, something that belongs. The door closes gently. The garden is left to the night. Somewhere beneath the soil, seeds begin their slow, invisible work. And for once, nothing needs to be pulled out, only allowed to grow. He keeps a small piece of wood on a shelf in the garage. It started as nothing. A leftover block from a cheap set of shelves he built months ago. The kind of thing most people would toss into the trash without thinking. But he didn't. He slipped it onto the shelf and forgot about it until one Saturday afternoon when he found himself standing in the garage, again restless and slightly annoyed for reasons he couldn't explain. The garage is quiet in a very specific way. No music, no conversation, just the faint tick of the water heater in the corner and the occasional creak of the house settling. The overhead light buzzes softly and dust floats through the air when the door is half open. He pulls the block of wood down and turns it in his hands. It's rough on the edges, splintered in one corner, plain and unfinished. Nothing about it looks valuable. He thinks for a second that it matches the way he's been seeing himself lately. Not broken exactly, just not shaped right, not polished. Not the kind of person who seems to move through life cleanly. He has good days, and then days where he slips back into the same habits, the same thoughts, the same quiet disappointment. He sets the wood on the workbench and reaches for sandpaper. The sheet is old and curled at the edges, but it still works. He wraps it around the block and starts rubbing slow at first, then more steady as his arms find a rhythm. The sound is soft and repetitive. Scratch, scratch, scratch. A simple noise that doesn't demand anything from him. He hasn't called it healing. He wouldn't. That word feels too big, too serious. This is just something to do with his hands. Something physical so his mind doesn't have to keep circling the same stories. But the truth is, he's been trying to change. not in the loud, inspirational way. More like someone quietly rearranging a room so they can breathe again. He's been trying to stop snapping at people when he's tired, trying to drink less, trying to stop scrolling late at night, trying to stop talking to himself like an enemy. He's been trying, and it hasn't been clean. Some mornings he wakes up and feels proud for no reason. Other mornings he wakes up and the weight is back as if nothing changed at all. He'll do well for a week, then slide. He'll make progress, then get frustrated and wonder if he's fooling himself. The sandpaper keeps moving. The wood warms slightly under his hands. Tiny flakes fall onto the workbench, collecting like pale dust. He wipes them away with his palm, then keeps going. There's a thought that's followed him for years, quiet but sharp. If you were really better, it wouldn't take this long. If you were really strong, you wouldn't have to keep working this hard just to feel normal. He presses a little harder, then catches himself and lightens the pressure. Too much force digs, grooves into the surface. He knows that from experience. He's ruined things that way, before convinced that harder meant faster. But harder doesn't always mean better. He pauses and runs his thumb along the edge. It's smoother now, but not perfect. He can still feel roughness where the grain changes direction. He looks at it and feels a familiar urge to judge, to call it not enough, to toss it aside. Instead, he picks it up and turns it again, looking at it from a different angle. The light catches on the parts he's already smoothed. The rest is still raw. It occurs to him gently that he's been doing the same thing to himself. He keeps looking at the rough parts as if they cancel out everything else. He keeps treating the unfinished places like evidence that he shouldn't even be trying, as if being in process is somehow embarrassing. But the wood isn't ashamed of being a block. It doesn't pretend to be a table leg or a picture frame. It doesn't compare itself to the finished shelves nearby. It simply sits here ready to be shaped without hating what it is today. He sets the block down again and resumes sanding slower, more even. Scratch, scratch, scratch. The rhythm steadies his breathing. His shoulders drop. His jaw unclenches. He realizes he's been thinking of himself as the stone-heavy, stubborn, hard to change. But maybe he's also the hands. Maybe he's the one doing the shaping. Not all at once, not perfectly, but consistently in small motions that add up. A car passes outside, tires hissing on the street. The sound fades. The garage remains. He keeps sanding, not because he believes he can become flawless, but because he's starting to believe that gentle work counts. He stops sanding when his arms start to feel it. Not pain, just that low, honest signal that says enough for now. He sets the sandpaper down and stretches his fingers, watching the fine dust cling to his skin. It leaves faint lines in his palm, settling into the creases like it belongs there. For a moment, he considers wiping it off right away. Then he doesn't. He looks at the block of wood again. It's changed. Not dramatically. Anyone else might not even notice. But he does. The edges are softer. The shape feels calmer, somehow less defensive. It's still just a block, but it's no longer fighting his hands. He thinks about how often he's tried to rush himself. How many times he's told himself that by now he should be different, more disciplined, less reactive, past certain habits, past certain fears, as if there were a finish line he somehow missed, and now he's permanently behind. That pressure has never helped. It's only made him tense, careful in the wrong way, afraid to make mistakes because mistakes feel like proof. He leans back against the workbench and exhales. The garage smells faintly of sawdust and old paint. It's not a comforting smell exactly, just familiar, real. He realizes something that surprises him. Every time he's tried to change himself by force, he's treated himself like a problem to be solved. Something in the way, something resistant. But when he treats himself like material, something workable, something with grain and texture, everything shifts. Material isn't bad for having limits. It just has properties, directions it wants to move, places where it resists, and places where it yields easily. He picks the block up again and runs his thumb along the surface, this time without looking for flaws, just noticing. The places where the grain curves, the places where sanding takes longer, the places that will never be perfectly smooth no matter how much effort he puts in. And suddenly, that feels fine. He's spent years thinking healing meant erasing the rough parts, flattening himself into something universally acceptable, something easier to handle. But sculpting doesn't work that way. You don't remove everything. You remove what doesn't belong to the shape you're uncovering. He sets the block down and switches to a finer grit of sandpaper. The sound changes, softer now, more subtle. The work slows. It requires more attention, less force. This feels closer to how he wants to live. Less dramatic change, more precise care. He thinks about the habits he's been trying to let go of, the ways he pushes himself too hard, the voice that tells him rest is weakness, the urge to become someone else instead of becoming clearer as himself. Maybe those aren't things to smash apart. Maybe they're just excess, old layers that once protected him but don't need to stay. He sands for a few more minutes, then stops again. The block is warm now, almost alive in his hands. He sets it upright on the bench, steps back and looks. It's still unfinished, and that doesn't bother him the way it used to. He doesn't feel the need to complete it today, or to decide what it will become. Shelf support, paperweight, nothing important. The purpose can wait. What matters is that the process feels honest. He brushes the dust off his hands and washes them at the small sink in the corner. The water runs cloudy at first, then clear. He watches it swirl down the drain and disappear. When he turns back, the block of wood sits quietly where he left it. No demand, no expectation. He switches off the overhead light and leaves the garage, closing the door behind him. Inside the house, things look the same as they did before. Couch, lamp, shoes by the door. Life unchanged in any obvious way. But he feels different. Not fixed, not transformed, just less at war with himself. He understands now that he doesn't have to choose between accepting himself and changing. He's always been both the stone and the sculptor. Always shaping, always being shaped. And the work doesn't require cruelty. It requires patience, attention, and the willingness to stop removing things that were never the problem. He sits down and rests his hands on his knees. They feel steady, capable. Tomorrow he might sand again. Or he might not. Either way, the block will still be there. So will he. And for the first time in a long while, that feels like enough. The bathroom light is too bright, but she leaves it on anyway. It's the only way to see what she's doing. The kid is in the tub splashing gently with a plastic cup, making little waves that hit the sides and fall back again. The water is warm, the air is damp, and the mirror is already starting to fog around the edges. She kneels on the bath mat with a towel folded across her lap. One hand on the faucet, adjusting the temperature, the other steadying a bottle of shampoo so it doesn't tip. She moves in small, practiced motions, the kind you learn when you're doing 3 things at once, without wanting it to feel chaotic. She's tired. Not the dramatic kind of tired where you're falling asleep standing up. The quieter kind. The kind that shows up in your shoulders, in the way your eyes stay a little tense, even when you're smiling, in the way your thoughts don't fully stop when the day is over. The kid laughs at something, maybe a bubble, maybe nothing. She laughs too automatically. It comes out soft. Real enough. She reaches into the tub and scoops a bit of water onto the kid's arm to rinse off soap. The water beads on the skin and runs down in thin lines. For a second, she watches it like she's never seen water before. A drop. Small, clear, unimportant looking. Her mind does what it often does when she's tired. It starts measuring. How much she did today, how much she didn't do, the messages she didn't reply to, the groceries she forgot, the fact that she still hasn't scheduled that appointment she keeps meaning to schedule, the way she snapped a little earlier when she didn't want to. She hates that part of herself, the part that keeps score, the part that acts like life is a test she's quietly failing. She takes a breath through her nose slow and looks back at the tub. The kid is making soup with bath toys, stirring the water with complete confidence. The plastic cup dips and rises, and the water keeps responding, patient and endless. It's strange how something so ordinary can feel so big when you're worn down. She wipes a bit of water off the kid's cheek with her thumb. The skin is warm, alive, right here. On the edge of the tub, a drop of water clings to the porcelain. It trembles slightly when the kid kicks. It holds on, then finally lets go, sliding down and disappearing into the bath water. And something in her shifts. Not like a breakthrough, more like a widening. She's been feeling lately like she's just one drop. One small person with limited energy, limited patience, limited time. A drop trying to handle an ocean of needs. Work, home, relationships, bills, expectations. The constant background noise of the world. No wonder she feels like she's not enough. A drop is not enough to be an ocean. But that's the wrong comparison. Because a drop isn't separate from the ocean. It's ocean in a smaller shape. The thought comes quietly without any spiritual language attached. Just a simple recognition, like remembering something she knew as a kid and forgot when life got complicated. She looks at her hands. They're damp. A little pruny at the fingertips from water. Not perfect hands. Hands that have done dishes, wiped noses, typed emails, held steering wheels, carried bags. Hands that have tried. She's been treating herself like a single unit that has to perform perfectly to deserve rest. Like her worth depends on how clean she keeps everything, how calm she stays, how much she can hold. But what if she's part of something larger than her daily performance? Not larger in a mystical way. Larger in the way life is larger than one moment. Larger than one bad day, larger than one sharp tone, larger than one mistake. A drop can look small when you isolate it, but when you see where it belongs, it stops being small. The kid splashes again, sending a wave over the edge. Water spills onto the floor. She reaches for the towel and wipes it up. No panic. No frustration, just a quick cleanup. She notices that she didn't get mad, not because she's enlightened, because she's tired enough to stop insisting everything be perfect. The floor can be wet for a moment. The world doesn't end. The towel handles it. That feels like a clue. Maybe she doesn't have to clamp down so hard on every detail to be okay. She rinses the kid's hair, watching suds run down and dissolve into the water. Soap is there, then it's gone. The water stays. She thinks about all the feelings she's had today: irritation, guilt, worry, and how she keeps assuming they're permanent. How she keeps acting like each emotion defines her, like each moment is a verdict. But emotions are more like soap. They show up, they swirl, and they dissolve. Something stays underneath them, something wider. She reaches for the cup and pours warm water gently over the kid's head. The kid squeezes their eyes shut and squeals, then laughs again. The sound bounces off the tile walls and lands in her chest, softening it. She looks at the water again, not as a task, as a reminder. She's not just a drop trying to survive the ocean. She's the ocean showing up as a drop, and that changes how the weight feels. She drains the tub slowly. The water circles the drain, pulling the remaining bubbles into a small spinning pattern before they disappear. The sound is steady and familiar, something she's heard hundreds of times before. Tonight she watches it a little longer than usual. The kid steps out wrapped in a towel, warm and clean, and already reaching for pajamas. She dries small arms and legs, the movements automatic now learned through repetition. When she finishes, the kid runs off toward the bedroom, leaving behind a trail of damp footprints that fade as quickly as they appear. She stays in the bathroom for a moment. The mirror is fogged over completely now. She wipes a clear circle with her sleeve and looks at her reflection. Her face looks the same as it always does at this hour. Tired eyes, slight crease between her brows, hair pulled back without much thought. She notices the urge to evaluate, to decide whether she looks okay, whether she looks like someone who has it together. She lets the urge pass. Instead, she looks at herself the way she looked at the water, without narrowing the frame too much. She sees someone standing in a warm room after a long day, still showing up. Someone whose energy isn't endless, but whose care keeps finding a way to move. Someone who has been measuring herself as if she were alone when she isn't. She turns off the light and walks down the hallway, following the soft sounds of bedtime routines. Pajamas rustling, a book being dropped, a voice asking a question that doesn't need a perfect answer. Later, when the lights are off and the house finally quiets, she sits on the edge of the couch with a glass of water in her hand. She takes a sip and feels it move easily down her throat, no effort required. It's strange how much she's resisted ease. She's been telling herself that if she relaxes too much, things will fall apart. That if she doesn't keep track of every detail, she'll fail someone. That if she stops holding everything tightly, she'll be exposed as not enough. But water doesn't work like that. It holds what it can, releases what it can't, and keeps moving anyway. She thinks about the times today she felt overwhelmed, how those moments felt total while they were happening, like the whole truth. And yet, here she is now, breathing normally, the day already thinning at the edges. The feelings didn't last. They never do. She's been confusing intensity with importance, treating every emotional surge as a final statement about who she is. But an ocean doesn't become small just because a wave rises. She rests her head back against the couch and closes her eyes for a moment. Not to sleep, just to stop scanning. Her body settles into the cushions without instruction. She notices her breath again. In, out. It doesn't feel heroic. It feels sufficient. There's relief in realizing she doesn't have to hold herself together as a single point. She doesn't have to be perfectly calm, perfectly kind, perfectly patient to be worthy of rest. She's allowed to have ripples. She's allowed to have storms. None of it takes away the depth underneath. She finishes the water and sets the glass on the table. A small ring of moisture forms beneath it. She wipes it away with her sleeve, then smiles faintly at herself. Some habits stay. She stands and turns off the last light, the house slipping into darkness without resistance. In the quiet, she feels something steady beneath the usual noise of her thoughts. Not confidence, not certainty, just space. Enough space to hold tiredness without judgment. Enough space to let the day be what it was without turning it into a verdict. Enough space to remember that she belongs to something larger than any single moment. As she heads toward bed, she doesn't try to carry the ocean with her. She doesn't need to. It's already here. The notebook is still blank. Not completely blank, there are a few words written at the top of the page, crossed out once then twice. The pen rests beside it, uncapped, drying out slowly. He sits at the small desk near the window chair, pulled in close shoulders, slightly forward like he's trying to make himself smaller. Outside, the afternoon moves on without him. Cars pass, someone laughs, a door closes. Ordinary sounds that don't ask him what he's doing with his life. He's been staring at the page for longer than he wants to admit. This was supposed to be the moment things became clearer. The plan, the direction, the answer to the question people keep asking in polite ways, so what's next? He doesn't know. and that feels heavier than it probably should. He taps the pen against the paper, then stops. The tapping makes the silence feel louder. His mind keeps offering suggestions, write something, anything, but none of them feel honest. Every word he considers sounds like a role he'd be stepping into, not a truth he's discovered. He's tired of pretending certainty. On the corner of the desk sits a small block of wood. Pale, smooth in places, rough in others. It came with a cheap shelf he assembled months ago, an extra piece that never found a use. He kept it without knowing why. He picks it up now and turns it in his hands. It doesn't look like much. No markings, no clear purpose, just a solid, quiet presence. It fits in his palm easily, weight evenly distributed, not asking to be anything more than it already is. He thinks about how uncomfortable people get when they hear he hasn't figured things out yet. How quickly they try to help by offering labels, paths, suggestions, as if being undefined is a problem that needs immediate fixing, as if potential only matters once it's named. He's internalized that discomfort more than he realizes. Every time he pauses, every time he chooses not to rush into a decision, there's a voice that tells him he's falling behind. That being unshaped means being unworthy. The block of wood doesn't seem to care. It doesn't apologize for being unfinished. It doesn't lean toward any particular outcome. It simply exists complete in a way that doesn't depend on form. He sets it down on the desk and looks at it from a distance. In this light, the grain is visible, thin lines running in different directions, subtle variations that would guide any carving done later. The wood already knows how it wants to be shaped. It just hasn't been forced yet. That thought stays with him. He's been treating this in-between space like a failure, like wasted time, like a gap he should rush through to get to the real version of himself waiting on the other side. But maybe this space is doing something important. Maybe not being defined yet is what keeps his options alive. He leans back in the chair and lets it creak. The window is open just enough to let in a cool breeze. It brushes his face, then passes on. No announcement, no demand. He notices how tense his jaw is and lets it loosen. A small shift, nothing dramatic. He's spent years absorbing the idea that worth comes from clarity, from knowing who you are, what you do, where you're going. That uncertainty is something to hide, something temporary, something to overcome as quickly as possible. But the block of wood has no anxiety about its future. It doesn't rush to become a table leg or a frame or a handle. It holds its shape and trusts that when the time comes, it will be shaped in a way that fits its grain. He runs his thumb along one edge, feeling the slight roughness there. Not a flaw, just unfinished. For the first time in a while, he considers the possibility that he doesn't need to decide anything today. That not knowing might be a form of honesty rather than weakness. He looks back at the notebook. The blank page doesn't feel as hostile now. It feels spacious, like a field that hasn't been planted yet, not because it's useless, but because it's waiting for the right season. He closes the notebook without writing another word, not because he's giving up, because he's allowing something to remain uncut. And that, for now, feels right. He doesn't open the notebook again that evening. Instead, he carries the block of wood with him into the kitchen, setting it down on the counter while he pours a glass of water. It looks slightly out of place there next to everyday things: keys, a folded receipt, a phone charging quietly, but it doesn't seem uncomfortable. Neither does he. He's used to feeling like pauses need to be justified, like stillness has to be productive to be allowed. If he isn't actively choosing improving or defining himself, then he must be wasting time. That belief has followed him for years, shaping how he moves through even the smallest gaps in his day. But tonight, there's no urgency pressing against him. He picks up the block again and turns it slowly. The light from the kitchen fixture catches the grain in a different way, now revealing subtle lines he hadn't noticed before. Some run straight, others curve unexpectedly, changing direction midstream. If someone tried to carve against that grain, the wood would split. It would resist. He thinks about how often he's done exactly that. Chosen paths because they sounded right, not because they felt right. Forced himself into rhythms that looked good from the outside but left him tired and hollow. Pushed through discomfort not because it led somewhere meaningful, but because stopping felt like failure. He sets the block down and leans against the counter, crossing his arms loosely. There's a faint hum from the refrigerator, steady and unremarkable. The house feels neutral tonight. Not comforting, not cold, just present. It occurs to him that he's been afraid of this stage, not knowing, not being decided, because it doesn't offer quick reassurance. There's no applause for potential, no validation for staying open. And yet, something about this openness feels protective. Once wood is carved, there's no going back. Once a decision is made, it carries momentum. There's shape, direction, expectation. All useful things, all limiting too. The uncut block holds everything. He realizes he's been mistaking pressure for progress, believing that if he doesn't narrow himself quickly, life will pass him by. But life hasn't been waiting impatiently on the other side of certainty. It's been happening all along, right here, in the unremarkable moments. He keeps trying to rush through. He moves to the sink and rinses the glass, setting it upside down to dry. Water beads on the counter and spreads into thin temporary lines before disappearing. No trace, no record. And yet the act mattered. He glances back at the block of wood. There's relief in understanding that he doesn't need to be defined to be real. He doesn't need a finished identity to belong to his own life. He's allowed to be in a state of readiness rather than arrival. The thought doesn't solve anything. It simply loosens the grip of the question. Later, he sits on the couch, the block resting on the coffee table in front of him. He doesn't reach for it this time. He lets it be there without interaction. The room dims as the evening settles in shadows stretching quietly across the floor. His phone lights up once with a notification. He checks it, then sets it back down. Whatever it is can wait. There's nothing he needs to respond to about who he's becoming. For the first time in a while, the future doesn't feel like a demand. It feels like space. He leans back and closes his eyes for a moment, listening to the soft sounds of the house pipes clicking, distant traffic, the low whir of something electrical. Ordinary signals that time is moving, even when he isn't pushing it. He thinks about how much of his worth he's placed on outcomes, on being legible, on being easy to understand, as if mystery were a flaw instead of a phase. But the uncut block is not confused. It is patient. It knows that being untouched is not the same as being empty, that waiting is not the same as stagnation, that there's a difference between refusing to move and allowing things to take shape in their own time. He opens his eyes again and looks around the room. Nothing has changed, and yet the pressure he brought into the evening is no longer sitting where it was. He doesn't feel inspired. He feels permitted. Permitted to be unfinished. Permitted to be undefined. Permitted to trust that when it's time to shape his life, the grain will guide his hands. For now he leaves the block exactly as it is, uncut, unrushed, whole. The path around the pond is quiet at night. Not silent, just calm in a way that doesn't ask to be noticed. Crickets fill the air with a steady rhythm. Somewhere nearby, water moves gently against the edge, a soft sound that blends into everything else. The pond itself is still. Moonlight stretches across the surface, pale and clear. The reflection is sharp tonight, almost solid. It looks close enough to touch, close enough to reach for. There's a pause at the edge of the water. The moon seems to float right there, resting on the surface, as if it belongs to the pond. It's easy to forget where it really is. Easy to believe that if you reached out carefully, slowly enough, you could hold it. That's how worry works. It presents itself as something real, something tangible. Something you can grasp if you just try hard enough, if you think about it long enough, if you reach a little further. A hand moves forward, hovering above the water. The reflection stays perfectly still, undisturbed. Convincing. The thought arrives quietly. What if this never works out? It feels solid, grounded, logical, like the moon in the water right there demanding attention. The hand lowers slightly. The water breaks. Ripples spread outward fast and uneven. The reflection shatters instantly, breaking into fragments that move away from each other, disappearing into motion. The moon is suddenly nowhere to be found. The hand pulls back. The pond doesn't look empty now. It looks restless, disturbed. What was clear moments ago is now confused, scattered, unreadable. That familiar tightening appears in the chest. This happens so easily. One anxious thought appears. It feels real, close, manageable. So the mind reaches for it, engages with it, tries to understand it, control it, fix it. And the moment it's touched, everything stirs. The worry multiplies, splits, sends ripples through other thoughts. Memories get pulled in, futures are imagined. The original concern becomes harder to see, not clearer. The moon was never in the water, but the mind forgets that. The surface of the pond slowly begins to calm again. Ripples widen, soften, then fade. The reflection returns piece by piece until the moon appears whole once more. Nothing was broken. Nothing was lost. Only the surface was disturbed. The same is true inside. When anxiety shows up, it often looks like truth. like reality, like something you must respond to. But many worries are reflections, not facts. Images shaped by light and movement, not by substance. The trouble starts when the mind tries to grab them. Another thought drifts through, I should think this through more. It sounds responsible, almost caring. But the memory of the water lingers. Reaching doesn't bring clarity, it brings ripples. The path curves slightly around the pond. Walking resumes slow and unhurried. The moon's reflection follows, staying just out of reach, unchanged by movement along the shore. The moon itself, high above, remains untouched by everything happening below. It hasn't moved. It hasn't reacted. It hasn't been affected. There's a subtle comfort in that. The worries that appeared earlier don't feel gone. They're still present somewhere, like the reflection still resting on the surface. But they no longer feel solid. They no longer feel like something that must be handled right now. They feel like what they are: images. Anxiety doesn't always lie, but it often exaggerates. It takes something distant and makes it feel close. Takes something imagined and makes it feel urgent. Like mistaking a reflection for the thing itself, the pond grows quieter again. The moon settles back into its place on the water, bright and unreachable. The path continues forward, lit just enough to see where the next step goes. No reaching, just walking, just letting the surface be. The water settles more quickly this time. Ripples stretch outward, then thin, then disappear into the dark. The surface becomes smooth again, like nothing ever touched it. The moon's reflection returns without effort, clear and whole, exactly where it was before. It didn't need to be fixed. It didn't need to be guided back. It simply appeared when the surface stopped moving. That detail lingers. The mind often assumes clarity comes from effort, from reaching, analyzing, rehearsing, from keeping a thought close until it finally gives up its meaning. But standing by the pond, watching the reflection return on its own, it's hard to ignore the opposite truth. Some things become clear only when they're left alone. Another worry shows up quieter than before. It doesn't announce itself. It just slips in, familiar and subtle. The kind that usually grows if given even a little attention. It's noticed immediately, not judged, not pushed away, just seen, like noticing a cloud pass across the moon. There's no reaching this time. No attempt to grab the thought, shape it, or pull answers from it. It's allowed to hover the way the reflection hovers on the water, present but untouchable. Without interference, it doesn't intensify. It doesn't branch out. It doesn't send ripples through everything else. It stays thin. The path curves again, moving farther from the pond. Trees line the edge now, their silhouettes dark against the night sky. The moon is partially hidden behind branches, visible in pieces. And yet it's still there, even when it can't be fully seen. The same is true for peace. It doesn't disappear just because it's obscured. It doesn't leave just because worry passes in front of it. It remains steady and unchanged, even when the surface looks busy. Anxiety feels convincing because it borrows light from something real. It reflects fear, memory, imagination, and turns them into images that look solid. But when examined closely, when touched, it falls apart into movement. This isn't something that needs to be remembered as a lesson. It's something that can be felt. The difference between reaching and not reaching, between stirring the surface and letting it rest, between mistaking the reflection for the moon. The night air feels cooler now. The sounds around the pond soften. Crickets quiet down. Water laps gently against the shore, no longer disturbed. There's a growing ease in not needing to do anything about what appears. Thoughts still rise. They always will. Reflections will continue to show up on the surface of the mind. But they don't all need to be engaged. They don't all need to be touched. Some can be seen and left exactly where they are. The moon hasn't followed the movement along the path. It hasn't tried to keep up. It doesn't care where attention goes. It simply stays where it is. That's the quiet reassurance in this moment. You don't have to chase clarity. You don't have to capture peace. You don't have to reach for what's already present. The path eventually turns away from the pond entirely. The reflection disappears from view not because it's gone, but because the angle has changed. The moon remains above, unseen but steady, and the mind, having stopped reaching, feels lighter, less busy, less pulled in different directions, not empty, just untroubled. The water behind returns to complete stillness. The reflection holds undisturbed by footsteps now far away. Nothing needed to be taken. Nothing needed to be held. The moment passed, and everything remained exactly where it belonged. The moon in the sky, the reflection on the water, and the mind no longer trying to grasp what was never meant to be touched. Wherever you are tonight, I'm grateful you chose to spend this quiet time here. If these stories help you rest, you're welcome to subscribe and return whenever you need a gentle place to land. And now, you don't need to do anything more. Let the night hold what you can't carry. And if sleep comes, let it come.